Jack stood on the cracked rooftop of the old observatory, with the wind brushing softly against his face, and the deep stars twinkling far above like ancient silent watchers. The signal had arrived 3 days ago, not through human radio waves or coded channels, but in a shimmering light pattern that danced across Earth's sky for exactly 17 minutes. At first, scientists thought it was a solar flare bouncing oddly off the atmosphere, but Jack knew better. He had seen the same pattern once before in a strange old file, buried deep within the wreckage of a derelict alien pod found near Jupiter's rings. It was a summons, a call not meant for just anyone. It felt personal. The world governments were slow to react. As always, committees were formed, theories argued, protocols delayed. But Jack, who was never much of a follower, had already made his decision. He had no political title, no fancy uniform, no crew behind him, just a stubborn mind and hands that had rebuilt dying machines into living dreams. So when the portal opened above the southern deserts, glowing like a tear in the fabric of space, Jack walked through it alone with a pack on his back and a grin he couldn't quite explain. Journey was not like stepping into a spaceship or teleporting through some sterile gate. It was more like falling through a dream of color and noise and sensation. His body pulled apart and reassembled in some place where physics twisted like a ribbon. Then silence. He stood on marble ground under a sky filled with 2 suns. Before him a city floated in the air. Not sat on the ground, floated, truly hung in the sky with golden towers, curling upwards like vines reaching toward some invisible heaven. Moment Jack arrived, figures in silken robes approached him with slow movements and glowing eyes, their faces partly hidden behind masks of silver and blue. They said no words but bowed in a way that felt more like a ceremony than a greeting. One of them held a scroll long and curled like an ancient invitation, written in symbols that burned themselves into Jack's mind the moment he looked at them. He understood their meaning not in words, but in feeling. He had been invited as a guest to the royal banquet of the Thalorian court, the most sacred event, held only once every 1,000 years. No other human had ever been invited, no other species had ever returned from it. Still, Jack smiled. He did not believe in curses or ancient rituals. He believed in instinct and preparation. He had brought nothing fancy with him, just a small translator, sphere, a multi-tool wristband, and a survival knife. Tucked quietly in his boot, they led him through halls carved from crystal that sang softly with each step. The walls pulsed with life, patterns shifting as if the palace itself were breathing. Alien art lined the corridors, beautiful and strange, showing creatures in various forms, offering gifts to a central queen figure, always seated, always towering, always surrounded by daughters. With long, sharp limbs and glowing eyes, Jack was given a room at the upper spire of the palace where clouds rolled past the window and soft lights danced across the ceiling. Like northern lights on Earth, everything was prepared with care: his clothes, his food, his sleeping quarters. He was not a prisoner, but he was watched, always gently, always politely, never alone. The queen met him on the second day, her presence grand and silent. She did not speak with a voice, but through a kind of hum that echoed inside his skull, a feeling rather than a message. She touched his shoulder gently and offered a smile that did not reach her eyes. Behind her stood her daughters, silent like statues, their expressions unreadable. She welcomed him with honor, thanked humanity for its strength and curiosity, and said the banquet would be held under the twin moons when they reached alignment. Jack nodded, but something inside him began to stir, something quiet and cautious. He explored the palace more often than allowed, slipping past soft guards, using tricks learned in darker corners of the galaxy. He noticed things, small details that others might miss, carvings that seemed to show a story of hunting guests rather than honoring them, tables that looked like altars, not dining places, and paintings that grew darker. The deeper one went into the palace. During a quiet moment in the library, Jack met a young alien, not royal, not dressed in gold, but in servant colors, pale and faded. This alien did not speak directly, but let its eyes and hands speak volumes. It showed Jack an old page tucked behind stone the image painted. There showed a human or something like it being surrounded not by food or gifts but by blades and flames while the queen's daughters danced in joy. The servant looked at him and made a motion across its neck, then vanished into the shelves. That night Jack sat by the high window, looking out over the floating city, his mind racing, but his face calm. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. He had not come expecting kindness, but he also hadn't come expecting to be offered like meat on a platter. Still he would not run. He would wait, listen, learn, and when the time came he would not be the one on the plate somewhere below in the banquet hall. The chefs sharpened blades not for cooking, but for ceremony, and the daughters prepared not dresses but claws and poisons. The stars above flickered again, as if watching once more, waiting for another story to unfold. Jack leaned back with a calm breath, the fire in his chest growing steady. The invitation had been sent, and he had answered it. Now the game would begin, and he would make sure he was not the one swallowed whole. Jack moved through the palace halls like a shadow, quiet and calm, but his mind was alert now, watching everything with sharp focus. The beauty of the palace no longer distracted him. The colors on the walls, the soft glowing lights, the warm scents in the air, all felt like a curtain hiding something darker behind it. He smiled when spoken to, nodded politely when bowed to, but inside he was already building questions, stacking them like blocks, one after another, waiting to see what truth would fall out. He was invited to a garden ceremony on the morning before. The banquet where alien dancers moved like waves through the mist, their skin changing colors with every step, their eyes glowing as they spun around him. The queen's daughters sat in a circle watching him with silent faces. One of them spoke at last, her voice soft but edged like glass. She asked him about human strength, about his bloodline, about how long a human heart could survive after being removed from the chest. Jack laughed at the question as if it were a joke, but her eyes did not blink. She only smiled and leaned closer, saying that human meat was rare in this part of the galaxy, that their traditions allowed only one guest per 1,000 years, and he was lucky to be chosen. Another daughter spoke, asking what fear tasted like on a human tongue, and if he would scream during the feast, or remain quiet like the last guest did 5 centuries ago. Jack kept his voice calm, his answers clever, pretending to be curious, pretending to enjoy their strange humor, but inside he felt the chill settle deeper in his bones. They were not joking. These were not metaphors or cultural games. They meant every word. He tried to find the servant who had warned him in the library. But the lower halls were now guarded by tall figures with eyes that never blinked and hands that hovered near, weapons shaped like silver spears. Jack pretended to be lost and turned back, smiling at the guards, while making a mental map of where every hallway led, how many steps between each door, how the walls curved, and how sound moved in the air. At a private tea ceremony, Jack was seated in a chair made of bones, polished smooth and painted with soft golden lines. The queen sat across from him, holding a cup of red liquid that shimmered in the light. She never drank from it, only watched him as he lifted his own cup and smelled the strange scent. It was not poison, he could tell, but it carried something old, something forgotten, a taste of memory that was not his own. She spoke without sound again, a humming in his mind that told him of ancient rituals of power taken not by war, but by consumption, of flesh that carried knowledge of lifeblood, turned into legacy of strength, earned through devouring the worthy. She said he had been chosen not for his face or his charm, but for the fire inside him. That fire must be passed on to the daughters, so they could grow into true rulers of the stars. Jack sat still, his heart slow, but his fingers tapping quietly against the side of the cup, counting seconds, marking time, waiting for her to stop. When she finished, he thanked her politely, then said he wished to meditate before the banquet to honor their ways and prepare his mind for the honor ahead. She approved with a nod and waved him away with a hand covered in rings made of teeth. He returned to his room but did not rest. He pulled apart the translator sphere and rewired it into a scanner using old tricks he had learned during a long mission on a mining colony near the Black Edge. The scanner revealed hidden energy fields under the floor, behind the walls, around the ceiling. The entire palace was a cage. Doors did not lock with keys, but with signals controlled by voices not his own. He tested a hidden panel near the bath chamber and found a tunnel leading downward, not meant for guests. Crawling through it, he reached an observation deck filled with mirrors facing the banquet hall below. There were no plates on the long table, no silverware, no food, only chains and small pools, carved into the floor, stained dark with something dry and old. This was not a place of celebration. It was a place of ceremony. A place of feeding. In one corner, he saw a skeleton, small and broken, wearing a metal badge marked with Earth's old emblem, the kind used by early space explorers. He bent down and picked up the badge, brushing away the dust. The name was almost gone, but the shape told him this person had come here long ago with hope in their eyes and silence in their end. Jack did not speak. He only placed the badge in his pocket and climbed back to his room, his mind now clear. He knew what was coming. He knew what the banquet really meant. But he also knew something else. The Queen and her daughters believed he was just another brave guest, another creature with honor in his blood and fear in his bones. They had never seen a human fight with no weapons, with no allies, with only the will to survive and a mind sharp enough to turn cages into traps. Night came and the twin moons began to rise, inching slowly toward alignment. The city outside the palace shone with light, and music echoed in the sky. The halls filled with scent and song. But Jack sat still in his room with his back straight and his eyes open, watching the sky, waiting not for death, but for his moment. The banquet was ready. The daughters were dressed in silk, sharp with poisons and bright with hunger. The Queen smiled from her throne, whispering softly to her guards that this human would bring a stronger legacy than the last. But none of them saw the fire building. Behind Jack's calm gaze, he'd walked into this place as a guest, but he would not stay that way. He would not be served. He would survive, and when he was done, this palace would remember what it meant to invite a human to dinner. Bells of the palace began to chime, a slow rhythm that echoed across the floating city and rippled through the air, like waves touching every spire, every balcony, every chamber. The banquet was no longer a secret. It was now a living breath inside the halls, the sound pulling every eye toward the grand chamber, where fate would play its cruel game. Jack stood near the tall window of his room, where the stars blinked without care, and the twin moons had finally kissed in perfect alignment above the golden towers. He did not wear the ceremonial robe left for him on the bed. Instead, he dressed in layers meant for movement, soft fabric tight around his limbs, pockets filled with small tools, broken tech wires wrapped in his belt, and a blade tucked near the back of his neck, hidden under the collar. His breath was steady, his steps quiet, as he left the room, not through the grand door, but through the narrow tunnel behind the mirror, the one he had found 2 nights ago. The palace had changed its shape as night took over. The walls no longer welcomed guests. They shifted with the movement of thought, closing behind footsteps, opening only when commanded by the Queen or her daughters. The floating drones that once sang with music now hovered in silence, their eyes scanning every corner, their limbs sharp like needles made to follow, not to warn. Jack stayed low under the moving lights, his path lit only by the faint glow of his repurposed scanner strapped to his wrist. He reached the upper balcony, overlooking the feast hall, the place where the table now lay bare, long and curved, like a serpent's spine, polished to reflect the glowing ceiling above. The daughters stood in formation, not with cups or dishes, but with spears made of bone and cloaks that swayed like shadows, their eyes fixed on the entrance, waiting for the guest to appear and kneel. The Queen stood at the far end of the room, tall and silent, her hands folded before her chest, her crown a living shape pulsing with light, as if it were part of her very body. Jack did not enter the hall. Instead, he moved through the servant corridors, past the kitchen where fire burned with green flame and vats of liquid bubbled like living things. He placed a small device behind a panel where the energy line fed into the chamber. It would delay the force fields just enough to give him movement. When the time came, he passed through the storage room filled with herbs and minerals, but none of them smelled like food. They smelled like blood and sleep and pain. One of the daughters left the hall, her footsteps light but sharp as she moved toward a side room carrying something under her arm that looked like a ceremonial cloth, but dripped dark at the edges. Jack followed her just close enough to watch as she unfolded the cloth, to reveal a curved hook glowing with warmth, fresh and sharp and hungry. She whispered a prayer to the stars, then began to hum a tune that did not sound like music, but more like a lullaby meant for the dying. Jack stepped back, keeping his breath quiet, then moved toward the chamber below the throne, where the palace heart lived. The palace heart was not a machine, not in the way humans built machines. It was a living thing, a pulsing root that connected every wall, every door, every system through a web of light and motion. Jack had studied it from maps hidden inside the servant quarters, traced its shape with chalk on the floor when no one watched. He placed another device beside the root, not to break it, but to twist it, bend it enough to turn the queen's control into confusion. The bells changed their tone, a sharp shift that signaled the time had come. The banquet had begun, and the guest was now late. The queen raised her hand, and the drones scattered like insects, searching every hall, calling with soft chimes. The daughters began to move, their spears held like dancers in a sacred trial, their faces calm, their steps perfect. But Jack was no longer a guest. He had become something else. He was now the storm behind the calm. He returned to the upper balcony, where he dropped a small orb into the air. It hovered, then released a wave that blurred the room like fog. The lights dimmed, the walls flickered, the drone stalled. The queen turned her head just as Jack landed behind one of the guards, disabling him with a silent strike and grabbing the spear from his hand. The hall erupted in motion, but Jack moved through it with focus, his steps quick, his aim sharp, his blade flashing once, then twice. Did not fight like the warriors they had known. He did not follow form or style. He used chaos. He used timing. He used the memory of running from danger through broken streets back on Earth, where survival was learned, not taught. One daughter charged with a scream, her weapon raised high, but Jack stepped aside, grabbed her by the wrist, and turned her own force against her, sending her crashing into a wall that now sparked with broken light. Another tried to trap him with energy ropes, but Jack had already disabled the control. He spun behind her, used a broken plate as cover, and slammed her into the ground with a crack that silenced her chant. The queen watched with stillness, her face unreadable, her daughters falling one by one, not to power, but to unpredictability, to the one thing their rituals had never prepared for. A human who refused the role given to him, who rewrote the story in the middle of the page. Jack stood in the center of the hall, now breathing heavy, but his eyes never leaving the queen. Around him lay the signs of his will, not destruction, but defiance. The proof that humanity was not food, not prey, not a tale to be swallowed. He pointed his blade toward the throne, not as a threat, but as a message. The queen stepped down, her hand still folded, her crown dim now, her voice entering his mind like smoke, telling him he had broken the sacred order. Jack replied with no words, only silence, and the slow step forward that said more than any sentence could. He had not come to die, he had come to show what it meant to be human. The palace trembled, not from fear, but from change, the walls sensing the shift in power, the balance broken, the tradition undone. And in that moment, Jack knew the hunt had ended, not with his fall, but with his rise. He had survived the first strike. Now came the reckoning. The hall stood in silence, broken only by the soft hum of failing lights and the distant echo of alarms that had not been heard for centuries. The queen remained at the edge of the long room, her eyes still locked on the one who should have bowed, but had instead risen like a blade from the dust. Jack did not move quickly now, his steps were slow, measured. like each one was a decision carefully placed in the book of this moment. The queen's daughters, who remained upright, circled him like shadows, unsure, now not because of fear, but because the pattern had shifted and their ancient dance no longer made sense. The palace watched them, walls breathing in slow pulses, floors glowing in waves like the rhythm of some unseen heart. But Jack no longer saw beauty in the design, only purpose hidden beneath elegance, like a beast beneath silk. He had not come to start a war, yet the moment had arrived, not through his desire, but through their mistake. They had invited a human to the table, thinking he would be curious, obedient, respectful in the way the others had been, but they had not seen the flame inside him. They had not imagined a guest who could burn the whole feast to ash. Jack raised his hand, not in peace, but in warning, as if to give one final chance before the tide turned completely. The queen tilted her head, her lips parting slightly, not in speech but in command. A wave of energy struck toward him, shaped by invisible force, meant to throw his body to the ground and bind it with pressure. But Jack had already seen it coming. His device triggered a pulse from the modified scanner, which shattered the stream into harmless sparks. One of the daughters moved to strike, her blade high, her voice sharp with ritual, but Jack stepped inside her swing before it could fall, twisting her arm and sending her into the central pillar, where crystal cracked under her weight. Another came at his side, quick and silent, but he had placed a trap earlier, hidden near the edge of the wall, and when she stepped onto the panel, the floor beneath her shifted, releasing a burst of compressed light that blinded her long enough for him to knock her unconscious with the blunt end of a spear. This was no longer a hunt, it was a lesson. Jack was not simply defending himself, he was reshaping the rules around him, using the very tools of the palace as weapons against their creators. He moved from hall to hall, guiding the fight away from civilians, away from those who had served, quietly, never knowing the truth behind the banquet. Guards tried to block his path, but he avoided killing them, instead disabling each one with strikes that left no permanent harm, only confusion and memory. He reached the throne chamber, where the queen had retreated, her daughters now scattered, some wounded, some fled, some hiding behind pillars carved with the victories of long-forgotten feasts. Jack stepped forward, his eyes locked on the queen, whose crown now flickered, as if unsure whether it still belonged on her head. She did not speak, she only stared at the human before her, whose breath was steady, whose hands were scarred not from this battle but from years of struggle in places far beyond this one. She raised her arms and the chamber responded. The walls opened to reveal the palace heart, the living root that connected everything in the city, pulsing now with panic as the structure sensed something it had never felt before, defiance without fear. Jack took a step toward the root, not to destroy it, but to claim it. He held out his device, and the signal passed through the air, rewriting the permissions, encoded in its oldest layers, permissions that had never considered a human could touch its code, let alone change it. The light shifted the walls, steadied the drones that once hovered like hunters, now floated silently, their commands broken, their purpose now unbound. Jack turned back to the queen, who had taken one slow step down from her throne, and stood with her hands lowered, no longer glowing, no longer filled with command. Her voice entered his mind again, but it was different, now slower, uncertain. She asked what he wanted, why he had fought, why he had not accepted the honor given to him. Jack replied, not with violence, but with truth. He told her humans did not live to be honored by death, that strength was not measured by blood spilled, but by will that burned against the cold. He said he had come because he believed in peace, but peace built on ritual killing was no peace at all. The queen did not answer, only stood silent as the root behind her flickered with strange light, no longer royal, no longer sacred, just a system now under new control. He could have ended her, then taken the throne, shattered the dynasty, declared himself conqueror, but he did not. Jack turned his back to her and walked away, leaving behind the chamber of power, as a sign that power alone meant nothing unless guided by something stronger than hunger. He broadcast a message through the palace system's opening channels that had been locked for centuries, showing the footage of what had happened, revealing the truth behind the banquet, showing the faces of those who had fallen not as monsters, but as victims of tradition that had been passed down without questioning. Every corner of the city screens flickered to life and silence fell over every district as the people watched the story unfold, not in legend, but in real time. A human standing where no other had survived, speaking not of revenge but of change. Jack made no threats, offered no warnings. He only spoke of truth and choice, and left the rest to them. Queen remained in her chamber, no longer speaking. Her daughters gathered around her, their eyes still wide, not with hate, but with something close to wonder. Jack walked back through the halls, stepping over cracked stone and spilled light, his blade now sheathed, his breath steady, his shoulders relaxed. The palace no longer tried to stop him. It let him pass as if it too had accepted the shift, as if the walls themselves had grown tired of old stories. As he reached the outer platform, where a ship now waited ready to carry him home, he looked once more over the city that floated in the air like a dream, and saw for the first time not a prison, but a place ready to wake. He did not smile, he did not wave, he simply stepped onto the ship and prepared for the return, knowing the banquet had ended, not with a meal, but with a memory, one that would never be forgotten. Stars stretched across the black sky like silent fires frozen in place as the ship broke through the upper edge of the alien planet's atmosphere, the engines humming low and steady, carrying Jack away from the floating palace that had once shimmered with illusion, now resting in quiet stillness. Behind him, the air inside the ship was cold and dry, the metal beneath his boots smooth and familiar, like the floor of a workshop back home, where things could be built, repaired, changed. He stood near the wide viewing window, eyes fixed not on the stars ahead, but on the world he had just left, the world that had nearly swallowed him whole in a banquet meant to honor tradition through blood and fear. He had walked into that place without allies, without weapons designed for war, without knowledge of their true intent, yet who had walked out not as a hero, not as a legend, but simply as a human who refused to kneel, and that refusal had become the sharpest blade in the room. Across the galaxy, signals were already spreading, his voice carried by the transmission. He left behind, not dressed in flames, not wrapped in victory, but spoken plainly with the weight of truth pressing down on every word. Jack knew that truth had a strange power. Once it was heard, it could not be buried again. Once it found ears ready to listen, it did not be locked away behind crystal walls and golden crowns. He leaned back in the pilot's seat as the ship's course adjusted automatically toward the nearest relay station, where Earth's outpost waited, unaware of what was coming. He had a story to deliver, and it was not a quiet one. Far below in the floating city, the Queen sat alone in her chamber, her daughters standing not as hunters now, but as daughters unsure of their place in a world that no longer followed the rhythm of old songs. The crown no longer pulsed the throne, no longer shimmered the great table at the center of the banquet hall had been cleared, not of bones or spilled blood, but of purpose and fear. For the first time in 1,000 years, the palace echoed with questions, not chants, and the people gathered beyond the royal walls waited not for orders, but for answers. In districts once silent with obedience, citizens now whispered about the guest who had left, not as food, but as fire, about the moment the Queen had stepped down, not with rage but with silence, about the message he had sent, not as a threat but as a mirror. Across other planets connected to the old empire, similar messages began to rise, voices that had long slept now found breath again, calling for an end to the banquet, an end to the belief that power came through domination. The galaxy was vast, but words traveled faster than ships once released. They found paths through every signal hub, every communication link, every curious ear. Jack had not brought an army. He had not fired a missile, yet something had changed in the way stars looked down. Now not as cold watchers, but as silent witnesses to a shift that no one could undo. Back aboard the ship, Jack sat in the quiet hum of space eating a simple meal from a small metal pack. Nothing rich, nothing royal, just food meant to keep a body moving forward. He stared at the screen beside him where old news from Earth played without sound. Buildings still stood, cities still buzzed. People still argued over small things, yet he knew that when he returned something in their eyes would shift when they saw him. Something in the way they looked up at the stars would carry new weight. The invitation had not been meant for Earth. It had been set out of tradition, expecting submission, expecting admiration. But what they received instead was understanding, sharpened by resistance, and now Earth stood, not just as a planet among many, but as a voice that had spoken when silence was expected. Jack had not planned to represent his species. He had simply answered a call and refused to become what they had wanted him to be. Ship crossed into communication range with the Earth outpost, and a message came through, soft and curious, asking for identity and purpose. Jack answered simply by name and origin, nothing more. Yet, in the tone of the reply, he sensed something had already reached them, some fragment of his story carried through unofficial lines, whispered between stations, and crews passed like fire along dry grass. When he landed days later on the red soil of the outer colony station, the dock workers stopped to look, not with applause, not with ceremony, but with respect, quiet and honest, the kind that does not need words. A commander came forward offering his hand, and Jack took it with a nod, the two speaking, not as soldier and survivor, but as men who had both seen corners of the galaxy that never made it into official reports. He handed over a drive containing the recordings, the images, the voice logs, the names carved into palace stones, names of those who had gone before and never returned, now remembered again. He said nothing else, just turned and walked toward the inner buildings of the station, where the smell of oil and dust reminded him of Earth, where machines were built by tired hands, and stories were shared over cheap food and long nights. That night, under an artificial sky filled with projected constellations, Jack stood alone near the edge of the station roof, watching the stars just like he had done before the invitation ever arrived. He knew more would come, new threats, new challenges, new moments that would test what humanity had become. But he also knew something had shifted deep in the story of who they were. They were no longer the young species, lost in a galaxy of giants. No longer the silent observers standing at the edge of ancient games. They had stepped into the light, not with banners, not with warships, but with one man who said no at the right time and meant it. Jack took a deep breath, the wind here soft and dry, nothing like the alien breezes he had felt in the palace, but somehow more real, more his. He looked up one last time, then turned and walked back inside the station, knowing the stars would never forget the night a human sat at the table and refused to be the meal, and somewhere far across the galaxy, in a palace no longer ruled by silence, a new story was being told, one that began with an invitation and ended with a name: humanity, the end.